Hey guys, back again for the third part of this series. I'd appreciate if you could please like, comment and subscribe. I'm trying to grow this channel. Just lately I've had a batch of new subscribers that literally have vanished overnight. I'm just looking to build it up and hoping some of you are subscribed and stay subscribed for more content. And also, please comment below, share content you find online or original content from yourself. I'll be happy to narrate this and put it on the channel. Well, once again, guys, you've blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to my stories. There's no way I can respond to each of you individually, so I'm just going to address some common things again. And then more on to the stories. I'm going to write as many as I can think of. In addition to my friend's stories, I'll probably not update again until I get a chance to answer some questions that myself have for my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found you all had. I'm not comfortable talking about where exactly I work. Unfortunately, in all reality, some of the things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble or fired, so it's best I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States and in an area that is compromised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest with mountain range and lakes. There's still a great amount of interest in the stairs, and luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll all find very interesting. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I have thought of asking my superiors about them, I have. But once again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of the former superiors no longer works as an SAR officer, and that it's possible that he may be willing to talk to me about it. I will be speaking to him later in the week, and I will let you know what comes of that. As far as advice from becoming an SAR officer goes, I think it is best that you find your local Forest Service office and see if they can offer a training course or what qualifications are. I've been doing this for years, and I started out as a volunteer helping on SAR operations. It's a great job despite the occasional tragic situation, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, let's move on to the stories. The first happened on a case that I went out on right after I got out of training and was still pretty new. Everything before I took this job. I was a volunteer, so I had a basic idea of what to expect. But on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after the vets have found signs of them. As an SAR officer, you'll go out on all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. These cases get called in early in the morning from a young couple who were up on one of the trails that goes by a lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear a woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we get there, we see him holding his wife, and she's got something in her arms. She's screaming these awful, almost animal-like, and he's sobbing. He sees us, and he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there. Now, obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up there. It's a walking path. So we ask him if his wife needs help, or if she can walk on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down and ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking, holding something, and just shrieking over and over. I crouch down and see whatever she's holding. It's covered in her blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front, and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms back gently so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby, obviously dead. His head is caved on one side and is covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself and get up and go get one of the other vets who's standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of pats my shoulders and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see her kid. Every time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us we can't have him, that he'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But eventually one of the vets manages to calm her down, and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMTs show up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving this kid. He died instantly from trauma to his head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and she told me later what had happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with their baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussy. The dad takes the kid out and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil. She trips, she falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling about 20 feet down his little gully onto the rocks at the bottom. The dad climbed down to recover the kid, but he'd fallen right on his head and was dead from the time he got there. The baby was only probably about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident and a series of events that colossalled into the worst possible outcome. Probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as an SAR officer, mostly because there aren't many animals that come around the area. While there are bears in the area, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are small ones, like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose. And let me tell you, moose are nasty motherfuckers. They'll chase after anything or any reason, and God help you if you get in between a female and his baby. One of the more amusing calls was a guy who'd gotten chased down by an absolutely massive male moose and was stuck up a tree. Took us almost an hour to get to him and then get him down. And when he finally got on solid ground, he looks at me and says, "God damn, them fuckers are big up close." I guess that's not really a scary story, but we'll still have a laugh about that one. Honestly, I don't know how I'd forgotten about this story, but it is by far the scariest thing that's happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone or in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experience like this, you tend to forget about them and move on. This to date is the only thing that ever made me really seriously consider my job. I don't really like talking about it much, but I'll do the best I can remembering it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent and told us what most parents do. Mikey will never wander away. She's so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before. We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her and spread out the standard search formation. I was partnered with one of my good buddies. We were sort of casual holding conversation while we hiked. I know it sounds callous, but you do sort of become desensitized when you've done this for long enough. It becomes a norm. And I think to a certain extent, you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to work this job. We searched for a good 2 hours, going well behind where we think should be. And we come out of a small valley when something makes us both stop in unison. We freeze and look at each other, and there's almost a sensation like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop, and I have this odd sensation of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt the same, but before I can, we hear the loudest sounds that I ever heard in my life. It's almost like a freight train passing directly by us, but it's coming in every direction at once, including above and below us. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him over all this deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we look around us trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us see anything. Of course, my first thought is it's a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs, and even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound goes on, and we're just trying to yell to each other. But even standing close together, we can't hear anything but this sound. Then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the normal sound of the woods come back. He asked me what the fuck just happened, but I just kind of shrug, and we stand there looking at each other. For a minute, I get the radio and ask if anyone else around us had heard that. But no one else said, even though we were all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I just sort of shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we check up on the radio, and no one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark, but because we don't have any kind of lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together, and we're calling out her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope that we find her, because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being out alone in the dark is awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daylight. At night, well, whole different beast. But we're not seeing any signs of her or getting any response. And around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous point. We didn't get halfway back, and my buddy stops and shines his light to the right of us in a really thick deadfall of a group of dead trees. I ask him if he's heard a response, but he just tells me to be quiet for a second and listen. I do. In the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both call the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's just this really faint crying. We head in the direction of the deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over, As we get closer to the crying, I start getting this weird feeling in my gut. I tell my buddy that something isn't right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it was. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again, and at the same time we both figure out the crying is on the loop. It's the same little hatching sob, then a wail, then a quiet hiccup, repeated over and over. It's exactly the same every time, and without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost composure like that, but something about it was incredibly wrong, and neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous, we asked if anyone else had heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds sort of anticlimactic, but that call fucked me up for a long time. As a little girl, we never found trace of her. We keep an eye out for her and all the other people we've never found, but frankly, I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the many missing person calls I've gone on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person and no body are found, but sometimes finding a body just leads to more questions than answers. Here are some of the bodies we found that have become famous in our team. So before moving on to the findings of this SIR officer, I just want to stop again and say, please, if you're enjoying the content, like the video and subscribe to the channel and share any content that you may have, what you would find interesting to hear. I am trying to grow this channel, so any subscriptions will be greatly appreciated. And now back to the story. Thanks. A teenage boy whose remains were recovered almost a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones and his camera almost 40 miles away from where he was last seen. The camera sadly was destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who had vanished a month earlier, and that was all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of a ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome almost 20 miles from where she'd vanished. She had died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. There were batteries and cooked meat in her stomach. When they did the autopsy, the coroner said it appears as if somebody had been taking good care of her. There was no suspect ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby, found a week after vanishing, in the hollow trunk of a tree 10 miles from the area he was last seen. There was fresh milk found in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl, found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground her family had been at the previous summer. Now, as a couple of stories my friend told me, I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and just your luck, he's had a close encounter with them. Though he doesn't have any explanation for them, he does have a bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy has been an SAR officer for about 7 years. He started when he was still a junior in college, and he had very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the same thing as mine did, which was to never go near them, touch them, or ascend them. For the first year, he did just that, but apparently his curiosity got the better of him. On one call, he broke away from the line and went to check out a set of them. He said they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished, and the dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw the set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house because they were carpeted and in pristine white. He said that he got closer, he didn't feel any difference or hear any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The other thing he said was that there was absolutely no debris on the steps, no dirt, leaves, dust, anything. And there didn't appear to be any signs of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which he found strange. It was less like things were avoiding them, and more like they just happened to be relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and didn't feel anything except a sort of sticky feeling you get from carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said he was terrified because the way they'd been stigmatized. He wasn't really sure what was going to happen. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported to some other dimension, and the other half was watching for UFO come swooping down. But he got to the top with little event. He stood there looking around, but he said the longer he stood on the top step, the more he felt he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you would get if you were in part of a government building you have no business being in. As if someone was going to come and arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger, and that's when he realized that he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sound of the forest was gone. He couldn't hear his own breathing. It was just some kind of weird, awful tinnitus. But the more oppressive, he climbed back down and then rejoined the search and didn't mention what he'd done. But he said the weirdest part came after. His trainer was still waiting back at the welcome centre after the search ended for that day. And he cornered my buddy before he could leave. He says his trainer had this look of intense anger and asked him what was wrong. You went up them, didn't you? My buddy says it wasn't phrased as a question, but he asked how his trainer knew. His trainer just shook his head. Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost her scent. My buddy asked what that had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he'd been up the stairs, and my buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave him a really awful, almost dead-eyed look and told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs, he'd be fired immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he never answered the questions my buddy had asked him about it since. My buddy had been involved in a lot of missing persons cases where there's never been a trace of them found. I mentioned David Pulids, and my buddy said that he confirms that those stairs are for the most part, accurate. He said the most of them, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found or they're found weeks, months, or years later in places they can't possibly have gotten. One story he told really stood out and involved a 5-year-old boy with several mental disabilities. The little boy vanished from a picnic area in the late fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped, and his parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone would have had to taken him away. My buddy says they searched for the kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range. But it was like he'd never been there. The dogs couldn't even pick up scent anywhere. Not even in the picnic area where he'd apparently vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their kid. The search was concluded about a month later, and my buddy said everybody had pretty much forgotten it by later that winter. He was out on a training op in the snow. No one over the higher peaks when he came across something in the snow. He says he saw it from far away. At first, when he got closer, he realised it was a shirt, frozen and sticking partway out of the powder. He recognised it as belonging to the kid because it had a distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, laying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been found dead for any more than a few days, even though he'd been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something, and when my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was, he said they almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a big chunk of ice that he'd been carved crudely into some sort of like a person. The kid was holding it so tight it had frostbitten his chest and hands, which my buddy could not tell, even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed the rest of the crew, and they came to look at the body and take it off the mountain. Now, he recapped all of this to me and put it in full. There was no way the kid could have both survived for almost 3 months on his own or have gotten to this peak. There was no physical way this child could have walked almost 15 miles and ended up on top of a goddamn mountain. To top it all off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing, not even water. It was like my buddy said the kid had been taken off the face of the earth and put in a suspended animation and then dropped on this mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He's never really gotten over that one. The last story I'll share from him was one that took place relatively recent, only a few months ago. They were out doing a recon for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout the area where these animals are seen to ensure that if there are any in the area, we can warn people and close off the trails. We were out on this part. He was out on his own in a very heavy forest part of the park. Towards dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, it sounds almost like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back and let the ops know what he'd heard. And that was going to keep going to see if he could figure out where its territory started. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, away from the same spot, and determined the more proximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time within only a few yards of him. Of course, he freaked out and started heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wants is to run into a goddamn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the path, he started heading back. The screaming followed him, and only broke into a jog. When he was about a mile from the ops, the screaming stopped. He turned around to see what was following him. It was almost night by this point. He said in the distance, just before the path round the corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the paths were closed and they needed to come back to the welcome centre. The figure just stood there, and my buddy started to walk over. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure took off, as he described, and it is an impossible long step forwards towards him and let out the same scream my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even know anything. He just turned and sprinted back to Ops, never looking behind him. By the time he got back to Ops, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anybody else, just said that there was a mountain lion in the area and that they would need to close those paths until the animal could be located or moved. I'm going to end this entry here, since it's turned into a huge wall of text. I'm going to be heading out on a yearly training up tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until next week. I'll be meeting up with a lot of former trainers and buddies who work in this area of the park, and I'll be asking about any stories they'd like to share. I'm so glad you guys have been interested in my stories, and once again, I'm back for this up. I'll continue to share them. Thanks for listening in, guys. Just to note, there is another part of these stories, and I'll renovate these and get these up soon. And if you can, please like, subscribe and comment to the channel. This would be greatly appreciated, and you'll hear from me again soon.